Welcome everyone. We don't have microphones. Also, there is a sound system that captures well. So I guess that means it might capture also sound around. So yeah, just try to be, we need to be considerate for our online participants, maybe with setup. Welcome everyone to this panel. It's called Beyond Compliance in a Chaotic World: How a Harm and Need approach can achieve a fuller protection in armed conflict. My name is Anki Sjöberg. I'm your in-person moderator today. We also have an online moderator here, my colleague, who will take questions from participants online. Without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Catherine Fortin, our keynote speaker, and I will hand over the floor to her. Just first, Catherine is the co-investigator of the Beyond Compliance Consortium research program. She's also an associate professor at Utrecht University, where she teaches international humanitarian law, or IHL, and international human rights law, and public international law. She has written widely about non-state armed groups, lawmaking, rebel governance, sources of law, legal personality, and the relationship between international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Amongst others, she's the author of Accountability of Armed Groups Under Human Rights Law, for which she won the Francis Lieber Prize in 2018. She is also the co-author of Armed Groups and International Law in the Shadowed Land, co-editor, sorry, of Armed Groups and International Law in the Shadowed Land of Legality and Illegality. She's also the founder and co-editor of the Armed Groups and International Law blog. She's the editor of the Netherlands Quarterly on Human Rights. And finally, and I think this, please keep in mind, she's also co-hosts podcast called Beyond Compliance in Conversation. It's a very interesting podcast that she's doing together with a political scientist. So you have the legal approach and the political approach analyzing key issues of conflict. So Catherine, you have the floor. We're very happy to have you here.
Thanks so much, Anki. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm going to try and speak up. Thanks so much for the introduction. So I guess I want to start by painting a little bit of a picture for this panel by telling you about this research project and how it's been designed, where it's come from, what we're looking at, and our methods. And I think Joanna's going to pick up from me and explore some of the concepts in more detail. So yeah, the project's name is the Beyond Compliance Consortium, as you can see on the slide. Its subtitle is Building Evidence on Promoting Restraint by Armed Actors, and it's funded by Development UK, and it's led at the University of York. So as we all know, you're all here, 2025 is proving to be another horrendous year in armed conflict. At the ICRC's latest count, there are 130 armed conflicts going on today, and we all know that behind that big figure, the micro figures are even more appalling. And I think against that backdrop, the consortium's work and design is more relevant than ever. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. So I hope that this clicker moves the slides on so you can have a look at the slides. The important thing to note is that this is an academic practitioner consortium. So we have 3 universities involved. So the University of York, Glasgow University, Utrecht University, where I'm from, and then we have 6 NGOs who are also partners in this research project. So their names are up on the slide: Watchlist on Children and Armed Conflict, the War Child Alliance, the IHL Centre, the Centre on Armed Groups, Civic, and Fight for Humanity, where Anki's a co-director. So the project's design, and I'm clicking on again, emerges from and draws upon thinking and insights that have been generated by previous research projects that the members of the leadership team on the Beyond Compliance Consortium have been involved with. So I just wanted to mention some, because if you're interested, you can look up some of these and see what their findings were. So on the top left-hand side, you've got a ritualizing protection project by Pepi Parisi. Then you've got the Civil Wars Pathways project by Anastasia Shesterenina. You've got the From Words to Deeds project, led by Anissa Belal and Ezekiel Heffers. You've got My Dangerous Liaison project, which was on civilian agency. And then you've got the Generating Respect project led by Joanna Chismas and Ezekiel Hefes. And then you've got a project called Beyond Compliance, same name, which you can find in the form of a report written by Rebecca Sutton and Emanuela Chiara Gillard, which was part of the Peace Wrap project. So all of these projects, their findings and their design have kind of fed into the Beyond Compliance Consortium as it is today. And I should mention that Joanna Chismas is the PI of the project, and the co-Is then are myself, Anastasia, Ezekiel, and Rebecca. So what are we doing? Well, to explain what we're doing, I want to share with you our research question, because I think that's always interesting to take a look at. And our research question, which is leading the design of this project, is the one you see on the screen. So what strategies have the most potential to generate compliance and restraint by armed actors? And more broadly, to facilitate fuller protection in order to prevent, reduce, and respond to need and harm arising in armed conflict. I think key to sort of understanding our project and its design and its title, Beyond Compliance, is the methodology that we've chosen for this project. So I'm going to share with you on this slide some information about the way this project is built and the thinking behind it. So a key feature of the project and its methodology is that the project's socio-legal in nature. And that means that we're starting as a method, not with the law, but with research into the everyday lived experiences on the ground. And we have 9 case study countries. So we have Yemen, Afghanistan, DRC, Colombia, Ukraine, Myanmar, Somalia, Syria, and South Sudan. You can find this on our website. So in gathering qualitative data on that, we're trying not to allow ourselves to be led by either legal concepts or technical concepts like humanitarian need or civilian harm. So that's why on our website you often see humanitarian in brackets and civilian in brackets. Another feature of our decision to start on the facts on the ground is that we're very deliberately adopting what we call a multi-actor approach. So that means that we're not just looking at harm and need caused by the obvious duty bearers that the legal framework points us to, but we're trying to look at harm and need more generally as it's experienced, irrespective of the actors causing it. So thereby inevitably taking into account harm and need that might be generated by or associated with corporate actors, for example, humanitarian actors or other private actors. And then it's only once we've gathered the data in the first stage of the research, so in that pink column, that we move on to the middle column. And at that point, we're looking at how the data maps onto the law, or how the law maps onto the data, in order to identify when the law is a valuable tool to address these experiences of harm and need, and when it's not. So identifying this then enables us to make progress in moving to the third column, which is our efforts to identify a toolbox of different responses or strategies, as we call them in our research question, to prevent, address, and respond to that harm and need. And some of those will, of course, be legal, designed to generate compliance. But others may be extra-legal, geared to, for example, generate restraint or a change of behavior, which may not be prohibited by international law, but may still generate harm and need on the ground. So to explain our title, our guiding philosophy in this project is that we're not doing anything without the law, but we also see value in going beyond it, seeing that the aim of the project is informed by a humanitarian imperative to address the lived negative experiences on the ground. And I think I'm going to leave it at that, Anki, to let Joanna, I think, take over and dig into some of those concepts a bit more, and we can talk about them in the...
Thank you so much, Catherine. So there's plenty of space here in the front, like everyone doesn't have to squeeze in the back. I don't think we have other VIP guests coming now, so please, if anyone is very squeezed in the back, please go ahead and come to the front. So yeah, I think Catherine, you gave us a great overview of the project, what we are doing. Just maybe a few words of framing of the panel itself. So as Catherine was saying, we are really trying to look at different approaches to understanding individuals' lived experiences. This is very important, and the harm and need. This is what the research is looking at. We are trying to look at strategies that are working. Today, in this panel, we would like to engage ourselves in a conversation within the panel with you, with the people online, also of trying to understand what the harm and need approach can do for us in terms of going beyond compliance, beyond the law, but not without the law, which is really what we are looking at. And what tools, ideas, strategies, and I'm sure we have also a wealth of experience here in the room, the people online, we were happy to engage and hear with you. So in terms of the planning, we have presentations. We also have one online speaker who's gonna join us from Nairobi. Everyone is gonna speak in English. So normally, if everyone is well in English, no need for the AI translation, but that tool exists also, as you know, through the Geneva Peace Week platform. We have a bunch of publications that arrived just this morning, so please look at them before you leave the room, also to know more about some of the outputs of the research project already. Yeah, I think that said, let's move into the substance of the discussion. So we are starting off strong with Professor Jana Chismas, as Catherine said, the principal investigator of this project. She's also the co-director of the Center for Applied Human Rights and a professor at York Law School. Before joining York, she lectured at Sterling Law School. She was a scholar in residence at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the New York University School of Law, and a research fellow here in Geneva at the Geneva Academy of International Human Rights Law and Human Rights. She's done also plenty of consulting for different international organizations, NGOs, amongst others. She was also a legal advisor to a member of the advisory committee of the UN Human Rights Council. She has also published widely, amongst other, on topics such as legal accountability, legitimacy of various state and non-state non-state actors. She worked on religious actors and international law. She has a PhD in international law here from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And Joanna, we're happy to have you back in Geneva for this panel. And let's move on to the question. So Catherine has given us a good framework of what the project is about, but please, could you give us some more details about the core concepts of the project, how they are linked to the research, the approach that we have taken, and some concrete experience also that you have from this project as principal investigators and also from the on-the-ground research work that you have been part of. So Jana, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Anki, and thank you to you and Fight for Humanity and Nicholas as well for organizing this panel, to the Geneva Peace Week for hosting us here, the Beyond Compliance Consortium. We're very grateful for that. And I personally always enjoy coming back to my academic home at the Graduate Institute, although back when I was studying, just to see my age, it was the Villa Barton that was the main headquarters. So yeah, it's really good being here, and thank you for coming to this panel. Catherine has done a fabulous job talking about our socio-legal approach and the sequencing that we take. We start with the lived experience on the ground, move to map that lived experience onto the law to understand what can be addressed through compliance strategies. I just see Tatiana and I have to say hello. and then understanding where you need to go beyond the law. What I would like to do is to talk a bit about the concept of harm plus need as we employ it, and how we came to this composite concept. And then I will move on to talk a bit about the compliance plus restraint towards further protection composite concept. So the Beyond Compliance Consortium employs the composite term harm plus need without the qualifiers civilian and humanitarian in an effort to ensure the conceptual openness to identifying and responding to local communities' everyday lived reality of armed conflict. And you may wonder, why do we do that, and what do we mean by that? Our conceptualization paper that is going to be published by the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law on the 8th of December this year starts by asking, who are the framers, that is the actors in specific disciplines and fields of practice that utilize civilian harm and humanitarian need? It then goes on to ask, why are these actors employing this specific framing of civilian harm and humanitarian need? So what is the purpose? What are they trying to achieve with the particular framing they're putting forward? The third question that it's asking is, whom are the framers targeting in terms of audience? And the last question is, what are the outcomes that arise from the use of this conceptual frames? What we find in that rather 100+ pages big article is that civilian harm is a term employed differently by different epistemic communities and communities of practice. You have a narrow understanding of civilian harm that deals with death, injuries, and destruction of civilian infrastructure. So pretty much what's captured by IHL. That is used by some states' armed forces and some NGOs that direct their advocacy towards holding actors accountable, specifically those involved in remote warfare. Humanitarian organizations, on the other hand, tend to use a broader notion of civilian harm, that is harm that ensues from violence, from coercion, but also from deliberate deprivation and presence, the mere presence of armed actors. If we move to humanitarian need, we see again that this is differently employed by different actors, as in a narrow sense, as survival, in a wider sense, as protection and rights realization, and in the broader sense, as development. So we have then overlaps of the concepts between harm and need, between civilian harm and need. Usually it's the broader middle notions where you find these overlaps. Now, what this framing and analysis has helped us to understand is that the way that the frames that actors put forward, why they have done so, has an effect in practice. They see the everyday lived reality of people experiencing conflict differently. They prioritize certain responses to the things that they see, but they also deprioritize certain responses to the things invariably that they don't see because of the framing they employ. So they do naturally exclude certain types of harms and responses to those harms, and they also invisibilize certain types of harms and needs. So what we do with our concepts of harm and plus need without the qualifiers is really to be open to a different material scope, a different personal scope, a different geographical scope, and a different temporal scope. Now, when you contextualize this, it might be that the material scope is broader, but it need not be. And I'm very happy to discuss this further in the question. So it's not necessarily a broadening of the scope we're achieving. It's rather more faithful, an openness in terms of seeing what is actually on the ground. Okay, how am I doing with the time? Am I doing well? Wow.
4 minutes.
Okay. So let me then come to compliance and restraint. Or no, let me give you a concrete example on harm and need. So what we see in the fieldwork that we've undertaken in Myanmar and on the Thai border with Myanmar, every single actor we have interviewed, extraordinary, every single one. So the actors we interviewed belong to 3 categories: armed actors and governance actors, including defectors from the Tatmadaw, local community actors, and international actors. We focused on the first 2 categories. Every single one of the interviewees that I sat on pointed out that the main harm and needs that they consider is experienced in Myanmar is not so much a physical harm, although that was mentioned, but it's actually mental harm and emotional harm. And that is not so much captured by any of the responses to the conflict that we have in Myanmar. It flies to a certain extent under the radar. And I think the openness of our concept captures that, but also captures an understanding of how the local actors are trying to respond and are actually the first responders on this harm and need. And it also, therefore, should direct donors and actors wanting to take action to ensure restraint from violence and abuse that results in this harm, but also compliance with IHL and human rights law to the extent that it regulates mental harm and the needs arising out of it. So it should really prioritize interventions on this aspect. It's not really necessarily something you think immediately when you're thinking about the situation in Myanmar, but this was something that emerged extraordinary from the field work. My colleague Samantha Holmes will have an article published next year in a special issue of the International Review of the Red Cross on mental harm and IHL, really looking very much into how far the legal framework addresses mental harm, but also going beyond and understanding what kind of approaches, including decolonial approaches that go beyond the law, might be useful in different contexts, and how it's important to actually fund those kind of initiatives, in particularly when they're led by local actors. And with that, I think I will stop.
Thank you. No, that's good. I think particularly the issue of kind of the longer term consequences and the idea that mental harm is often prioritized by local actors, even though external actors doesn't necessarily see that as the immediate need, and particularly for children. I think this is coming up in many of the cases. So I'm sure you're all also starting to have questions, so please take notes mentally, paper or whatever you have, so that you have them ready for the Q&A. We're gonna move on to Christina Kosak, who is a researcher at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. We all know it as CIVIC. I think she's working at the Ukraine country office. Christina has a Master of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She's concentrated particularly in international peace studies, and she also has an LLM in human rights. Christina has several years of experience, and we were discussing that a bit before, very, very impressive, particularly from working with big organizations such as NRC, UNHCR, World Food Program, She specialized in protecting civilians, accountability, and armed conflict. She recently also worked with the Register of Damages for Ukraine in The Hague as a research fellow. So, Christina, based on your experience from working now with Civic in Ukraine and doing research for this specific project, could you explain a bit more how the research project has been working specifically in this context? What has worked well? What has maybe been more challenging? Also, I know you already have some insights and ideas to share about the initial findings related to harm plus need and compliance and restraint in Ukraine. And we know you traveled for 29 hours to be here with us. So thank you very much for your commitment. And I'm sure the people will be very interested in hearing.
Thank you, Anki, for such a warm welcome, and thank you everybody for having me today here. As Anki mentioned, I'm covering Ukraine country office, and in Ukraine we are doing this research together with Kyiv School of Economics. It's a big think tank and a big educational institution based in Kyiv. Together we already finished data collection part. So if you remember these three types which Catherine was mentioning, we just finished our data collection. In our sample, we have 75 in-depth interviews. 30 of them are with active Ukrainian combatants, 25 are with local actors, and under local actors, we mean NGO and local authorities working in Ukraine, and 20 are with international actors. It's mainly UN and NGO, and we try to blend national and international staff to understand whether their perception of harm and need will be the same. We also have a small sample of quant data from the survey, also with active combatants, and it was very easy for us to get because Civic has a military engagement team, and we train Ukrainian combatants on protection of civilians. So normally when they attend our training, we give them a questionnaire to fill. With respect to the process, I would say we expected in the beginning that working with combatant will be hard because normally we ask question, why do you comply or violate AHL? You know, if you see the person for the first time and not the question which the person will truly respond to you. But honestly, also with the snowball sample, we were able to find quite easily Ukrainian combatants to talk with. And one of the reservation we have with the study, we did not talk to Russian combatants because we don't have access to the occupied area in Ukraine, because there is no NGO and UN present in the area which is occupied by Russia in Ukraine. Also, like what we saw that sometimes the combatants rescheduled the interview, but that's fine because the geographical coverage of the study was just on the front line. We covered Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv. It's the area which is also constantly under the blackout, so there is no electricity meaning no internet. And for some areas we couldn't travel based on the security situation. So that's on the type of the combatants. What we found a bit striking, what we didn't expect is working and like trying to talk to international actors. Several of them, like we actually face a bit high non-response rate, but that was based on the neutrality, and they didn't want to assess the conduct of hostilities. So that was the reason. But still in the end, we get like our 20 interviews with them. With respect to harm, I would say that we have the same observation as Ioana said, and we didn't expect to have that, especially within the combatant. I honestly expected that the majority of them would only refer to the physical harm, while all of them referred similarly. So the percentage was like 95% that the harm is not only physical, but also psychological. And if you live through war, that experience is already traumatic, and you need a respective response for that. Majority of actors, and I would say that was a consensus among combatants, international and local, that to the respect of harm, they also included cultural harm, and they mainly meant by that destruction of cultural property, but also looting of some cultural heritage. Also economical harm, and here we can talk about destruction of the residential property, but also like lack of access to livelihood. So the job market is also not like thriving, and also if you like the majority of women now in Ukraine should raise children alone. because the majority of the husbands are in the army, and it provides a very big economical restraint to the families as well. Some people didn't know how to describe the harm which might happen in occupation because it is not necessarily physical. You don't necessarily prosecute people in the occupied territory, but for instance, mostly all of the actors mentioned about abduction of Ukrainian children and their deportation, children indoctrination in school curricula, and also like the forced passportization. It's a necessity to get the Russian passport, like to be able to live and get access to basic services. So it's not a harm which you see as a physical, but it changes your identity. Also, with respect to the need, I would say the majority responded in a very narrow way with respect to the basic survival, though like the humanitarian need in Ukraine is insanely high. If you take the humanitarian response plan for the 2025, it's only covered for 40%. So there is not enough, obviously, resources to cover even the basic needs with respect to like housing, cash assistance, winterization, electricity, and apparently it's really hard even to respond to the mental health issue. And like there is several studies which says that 90% of Ukrainian children in Ukraine has PTSD. And obviously it requires a significant effort and a long-term response. With respect to compliance and restraint, I would say that there is no side which does not violate IHL. The question is to what scale. And considering that we only talk to Ukrainian combatants, you might find like my preliminary finding quite like one-sided, but that's the reality. Also, not being able to reach the other side, it's also kind of finding. So the majority of Ukrainian combatants said that IHL is important, but why they comply with IHL is because it's a moral obligation for them, and also because the war is being fought on Ukrainian land among Ukrainian people. So you are basically protecting yourself among your people, and I guess maybe if you shift the perspective to the other context, it might be different. Also, the secondary factor was dependence from the international aid. Compliance with the IHL is necessary, and also Ukraine is being now under EU accession need to comply with IHL. But also this factor was mentioned as a secondary, not primary. I would say that what respondents said apply to both army was the culture within military unit. If there is a culture to follow IHL, then there will be this compliance within the unit. Though if there is, conversely, if there is a violation, potentially into that violation, other combatants will be dragged to keep silent, to conceal these crimes. So we see that the culture within unit varies differently, and also in both army. And like how you can combat that, like to train them, but for some reason, there is a more willingness to train like Ukrainian soldier. With respect to the Russia and restraint, I would say that the majority of respondents said that sanction might work at the higher level. If sanction will be proceed, it might keep restraint from a further violation, but also several military analytics whom we interviewed, because I didn't expect, but several organizations in Ukraine frame protection and military analytics as protection of civilians. So one comes from the another. They also said that such practice as naming and shaming, finding somebody who is responsible for this specific crime might work, because there is a fear that you will be not even prosecuted, because if you will be not captured by Ukrainian army, you will be not prosecuted in Ukrainian area, but you will be known from doing war crimes. That's what potentially, and how we know that what Ukrainian combatants shared with us, talking to Russian prisoner of the war. With respect to some cases of compliance, the majority mentioned evacuation. Evacuation is currently being undergo in many frontline areas. Ukraine also has mandatory evacuation for children. So if you're adult, it's your choice. But if you are a child, you must evacuate from the front line. And Ukrainian and also international actor said to us that they saw a lot of action when There is from Ukrainian army, for instance, there was a planned mission and there was intelligence drone flight and saw the chaotic and not planned evacuation that the mission might be postponed. But also it might have, if you have enough equipment to have this possibility to get this intelligence. Also, several combatants told us that in Donetsk Oblast, some Russian troops were placed in the vicinity of ammonia plant, and Ukrainian army didn't attack that Russian troop site in order not to have a collateral damage and problem with targeting, because in other case it would cause a chemical leakage. So that also causes restraints. And among all of the interviews, we found several cases of restraints from the Russia side, and I want to talk about them. What we normally see, it's a restraint from violation which is targeted to several groups of people, and mainly it's children and elderly people. With respect to children, there was 2 months ago an operation of Russian army in Donetsk Oblast, and allegedly there was a household, and allegedly the parent got killed, and there was a child. There was an interception of the voice memo and a drone footage from how this works. And the Russian commander said, do not touch children, do not touch child, give her water, make sure she doesn't see a body. But also, obviously, it's a protection of civilians, but the future for this child is mainly to be deported to Russia. So it's like two-sided story. With the pattern of violence, I want to say like a few words. We see that the violence and the intensity of the war is only increasing, and I, as living also in the war and like we have in the international armed conflict from 2013, didn't expect that the intensity will be rising. But now, if previously last year for the 1 month we had like 600 or 100 drones per month, now it's a normal quantity for one night for the whole Ukraine. I'm living in Kyiv, and Kyiv is also often targeted by ballistic missiles like drones. And also now what we see how the warfare is changing with the usage of drone, honestly, and also with FPV drone. FPV drone is a first-person view drone, and it can reach anybody in the vicinity of 10-15 kilometers. And now it's a practice which established in Kherson and Donetsk Oblast when it calls a human safari, when there is a specific targeting of civilians and killing civilians with drones, and also recording this and sharing in media. And that's one of now the biggest threat. If you ask people what is your biggest threat, they will say drone. They need the education, have to be protected from drone. They need a special net to be protected from drone. And it's not, so there is a need, but it's not a typical need in other contexts. It's not a typical humanitarian operation to provide civilians net. But there are like areas where a lot of organization working on that and providing training for civilians, but also, for instance, Civic provide a lot of first aid assistance, like for, not first aid assistance, the training for first aid, because if you live in the front line, the likelihood of you being injured is quite high. And this is a knowledge which you need to keep updated all the time, because it's not enough to get it 1 time per year. You need to refresh it all the time. I guess that's it from my side.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Christina. I think we have a lot of food for thought there, and thank you for sharing. I think the point with the drones that you raised at the end is important. It's also something that legally poses a lot of challenges that might maybe come up later on in the discussion as well. And we know also from other cases where you have also non-state actors using drones, even against other non-state actors. So like this is something that is really spreading quite quickly. And also I think the point with the mental harm, the impact of the conflict, the drones is also something that I think that comes up quite a lot, like the fear of the noise, etc. People are afraid of bees because of the association with the drones. So yeah, these are kind of new developments, but thank you so much for sharing. And now we are thrilled to pass on to our online speaker. We have with us here Rama Abikar, who's joining us from Nairobi. Rama is an independent consultant. She's also the Somalia researcher at the Center on Armed Groups. Rama is an experienced consultant. She's been specializing in research, accountability, program implementation in Somalia, Kenya, and the Horn of Africa in general. She has a deep understanding of working in conflict-affected communities. She has expertise in community-based protection, participatory research methodologies. She's passionate about fostering security, peace, and governance through community engagement. So Rama, you're clearly at the right event. Unfortunately, you're not here with us in person, but at the Geneva Peace Week, these are our topic, I think, that many people feel strongly about. So Rama, in line with what Christina has explained to us, you have been undertaking the same type of research, of course, adapted to your context with different dynamics, actors, etc., for Somalia. Could you share with us also some of your experiences from this research project? What has been going well for you? What has also been challenging? Maybe some initial also insights that you have related to harm plus need, compliance and restraint. Some of the variations that you have seen, I think, linked to how different actors perceive, experience, and understand this concept. So, Rama, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anki. Thank you, everybody. This is a really interesting opportunity to express the thinking and the issues that are affecting people in Somalia. So as you've introduced, this is part of the BCC research program that's ongoing in Somalia. And the research is not completely done, but largely done. So we have conducted assessment among, so it's based on a partial finding of quantitative research conducted in Somalia. And we examined civilian harm, humanitarian need, and behavior of armed actors among, and also the research for this section that I'm presenting is based on the views of community actors and certain armed actors that include government government actors, as well as clan actors, but does not include the views of insurgent groups like Al-Shabaab, who are very important also, but this is part of the work that's kind of currently ongoing. I would like to share my screen if it is okay, just to show you the kind of numbers that we were thinking of. I hope you can see my screen. Thank you. For me, there's something that was kind of striking from the data that I was receiving. It was, so this, as I said, it was conducted among 74 participants, composed of armed actors and community actors, as well as, so the research was also conducted in quantitative, mainly through focus group discussions and in-depth interviews. And also we kind of did purposive sampling and mainly relied on local actors' understanding of the who is informed and all that. And also we did also snowballing to get to the right people. So a key finding from this research is that there was a significant divergence in views between senior government armed actors that we talked to on one side and the junior armed actors and ground-based community actors. So on one side, so the views of community actors, sorry, now yeah. So the research was conducted in 2 districts in Mogadishu. Within Mogadishu town, that's government controlled. And this was contrasted with another local a village outside of Mogadishu, which is contested by the government, as well as armed actor Al-Shabaab. So our local research partner also supported us with logistics, interviews, and also the management of the research on the ground. Sorry to take you back. Yeah, that was it. So the core finding was there was a divergence in terms of views in all the 3 sections of the the research that we assessed, the harm, the need, and the restraint. How the senior government officials described was distinctly different from how the community described, as well as how the junior actors described. So in terms of the senior actors, they kind of focused a lot on, in terms of harm and need, the definition, it was basically focusing on the casualties, the destructions, the number of individuals who are affected, maybe displacement, and very superficial level. And it was mainly perceived as unintentional and maybe incidental results. And it was partly blamed on Al-Shabaab. It was as a result, because we were defending the community, these were just unintentional damages and all that. But the community, as well as the junior armed actors, they kind of describe the whole spectrum of harm in it is and how they live it. They have described the physical damage it causes, the trauma and the psychological damage, the economic destructions, the markets that were destroyed, and the effect it had on their livelihood, the social fragmentation, families who were dispersed throughout the world, who could not support each other like they used to, the destruction of wells, rivers, and forests by the armed actors who were harvesting forests for charcoal and all that. So they had a more fuller explanation than how the government officials have described. So there's more, like, it's something that affects them. It's not just the community, but also this was corroborated by the junior actors. That was a bit more interesting. I would have expected all the government officials or the armed actors will kind of be on one side and maybe the community on one side, but this was not the case. It looks like there was a divide between the senior and the junior actors. And the other part on the understanding of humanitarian need, how the need was perceived is also dramatically different. The senior actors focused on the more generic, the shelter, the food, the water, the need for training for the armed actors and all that. And the community plus the junior actors, they saw very clear causal pathway where a specific harm creates a cascade of needs. They identified justice as the foundation requirement for recovery. So there was a saying by one elder who said, "We need to get just system, and everything comes after that." So it appears that they clearly understand the causal pathways between need and harm, and they're more honest, they more genuinely share their experiences, while the senior government officials, they kind of want to communicate what we should know, or how they will want the outer world to see their issues. Another thing on the perception of restraint, and why is restraint shown, the motivations are perceived by differently. The senior actors, they kind of saw restraint as the rules. They explain the rules that they have. The number of times they have restrained from conducting military operations because they were civilians on the ground. They clearly showed us the SOPs, explained to us the SOPs, how UN has supported them, and all the available conduct regulations. And so they just clearly explain how the military has a code of conduct that it follows to the latter and all that. But this was the junior actors were very clear on this. They see the absence of effectiveness of accountability. Many said the actors, they follow if they want, they fail to follow if they want, because If they go into problem with the issues with the code of conduct, and then they have the clan heads who will bail them out. So in the community also, they just see this formal regulation as strategic. There's no principle. There's not driven by it's only driven by tactical calculation. For example, they say Al-Shabaab now has relaxed the rules. They're not bombing everybody they used to. They're not killing elders who have seen associated with the government, not because they feel they care for the government, but because they want to attract loyalty from the community. And that's why they're being more lenient. So the community sees this kind of change of tactics more cynical than the government and also the armed actors will see. And there's absence of effectiveness and accountability, and which is the biggest problem shared by both the junior actors and the community. They say any people can follow rules because they want to, not because they have to. And of course, the armed actors, they themselves, they care for the community at some point, like the junior actors have mentioned, especially when they are acting within their communities, their family and friends are within that location. They will want to help, but it's not because they worry so much about a code of conduct, just because it's what they want, it's what they think is right. Because there's no effectiveness, there's no implementation of the rules, there's no accountability, nobody is there to push or pull when things are happening the right way. So another quote from a junior actor is, rules are often ignored and every soldier interprets them as they wish. So the conclusion here is like the official view, kind of easily masks, if you are to rely on that, you can easily mask the reality. The official narrative creates sanitized version of the conflict. This view fails to capture the true extent of civilian suffering, and relying on this narrative alone can really lead to misunderstanding and maybe need to lack of proper programming for the communities that are being affected. So maybe just something to bridge the gap is this need for enhanced accountability among ranks, and move beyond the system to create mechanisms that are felt and respected by soldiers at all levels. And another key thing should be the involvement of or integration of community level justice and oversight mechanism to ensure accountability is meaningful and transparent. Of course, has been a big challenge in Somalia over the last 2 decades. Over the last 1 decade, the international community has put so much effort and resources to support the establishment of an accountable army and accountable policing system. And still there are huge challenges, but I think this still will be the best way to focus on. Thank you.
Offices are sharing more the perspective of the community actors. I think that really has a lot of implications that we're going to be looking into now. Maybe also to stress, I think it's interesting to hear justice as a need also. I think that's really important to keep in mind. Also the harm to the environment, right? This is also something that comes up in other contexts that we are researching. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think now we're going to zoom out a little bit and then we'll dig down again. Just getting also back to the law. I wanted to hear from Joanna and from Catherine. If we zoom out and we see, okay, there is the need and harm focused approach. How do we link that to an approach more based on IHL? Like, do you see that there are complementarities, opportunities between the IHL compliance-focused approach and the harm and need-focused approach?
Should I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely don't see them as conflictual at all. I I see it as a sequencing question, truly. A harm and need first approach maps what's on the ground and then links back, maps this harms that we have identified with the rules that exist if they exist. This is the point. Some harms that we have found on the ground and needs that ensue from those harms simply do not map. There is less regulation. For example, I'll give you an example from Myanmar. It's also one from Ukraine. It's from many other countries. So you have adult conscription and recruitment. Conscription by the Myanmar state, the Myanmar Armed Forces, is producing profound, millions of people have fled so that they are not conscripted by the Myanmar Armed Forces. Millions. They're internally displaced or they are seeking, they have crossed the border but without actually any chance to become refugees, to seek asylum because of the system. Well, conscription by a government in IHL is not as such prohibited. Under international human rights law, we have some exceptions for conscientious objector, but this conscription remains very much today a domain reservé by states. So simply not acknowledging the harm that occurs is not really an option. But you also can't respond by saying, oh, you need to comply with IHL and human rights law because there's nothing as such to comply. Yes, you can develop these bodies of law further, and that's an option there, and probably we should. We definitely should, but it won't solve the reality of the people on the ground who are displaced, who are suffering. If you come to the non-state armed groups, recruitment of adults, again, I'm not talking of children here, I'm talking of adults, you see there, so in some of our interviews, we're saying, I very much wanted to participate in the fight to be recruited by the non-state armed group. However, by doing that, by joining them, my family was even more severely impoverished than they were before because I was the money that they receive is extraordinarily little for being part of the group, and therefore we talk to people who had been part of the armed group and then were no longer part of the armed group, and they dealt with this extraordinary mental guilt and they left because they needed to take care of their family, but at the same time they felt that they should still be fighting because they were fighting the. So how do you capture that by the law? It's just extraordinarily difficult to do so. We also saw consequences, gendered consequences. So for example, non-state armed group recruitment has, they also recruit women mainly in political wings, but not only. And families were pressuring women to marry, despite them not wanting to marry. So it's a question of forced marriage, because if they marry, then there is an exception in the domestic regulation of the non-state armed group that they don't actually have they don't have to join the group. So it's extraordinary what kind of really complex long-term harm at the family level, at the community level, at the society level. So non-state armed groups themselves were telling us, we understand that we're actually, by recruiting, we're actually affecting our future as a community, we're talking about ethnic armed groups. We're removing these people from studying, from being productive members of communities. And compliance is not an answer there. You need to look at extra-legal strategies. You need to work with donors and other actors to understand how you can solve the wider structural issue. It's not just a question of the driver of harm and need in that case is really not lack of compliance. It is something else.
And I think that the gendered aspects also, particularly in Myanmar, where you have then women who have to take on the roles of the men, and also like the additional risk that they are taking and moving around, the checkpoints, etc. That's also something that comes up. Catherine, you want to build on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I also say I'm a very visual person, so I like to think of the kind of toolbox with different tools in it. And you know, at times it may be that IHL is your key tool because it is the legal framework that contains a really clear prohibition, and in that case, it's really useful. But it may be that at another point, IHL doesn't say anything about it. So, for example, Joanna's just given an example, but to give another example, I did a research project on legal identity and the registration of babies in armed conflicts. And I was looking particularly at Syria, and I was looking particularly at territory under the control of non-state armed groups, which at a particular period in time was, of course, affected hundreds of thousands of children who, now if you look at IHL in that instance, you don't, and you look at the NIAC rules of IHL, you don't find any rules on the registration of babies. So in that instance, IHL isn't a helpful tool. So then you go to human rights law and you say, okay, well, what's human rights law about? Say that. And then you reach the problem that we all know about, which continues to rumble on about whether or not armed groups are bound, and different states feel more or less uncomfortable or comfortable about that debate. But, you know, you may find you've come to another issue like the one Joanna pointed out, where neither body of law is saying anything, but you're still seeing the facts on the ground showing that there's a real need. So, yeah, I think it's definitely not an either-or approach. It's just a recognition that the legal framework is that. It's a framework which puts sort of spectacles on that enable you to see certain things. And if you look at the world through those spectacles, then you need to sort of be aware that you're not seeing a whole host of other things. So I think the purpose of the project is to kind of start the project without those glasses on, and then put the glasses on afterwards. And certainly not with the intention of devaluing the law in any way, but more recognizing that at times law is going to be the absolute legal framework. At times it'll be IHL on its own. At times it might be human rights law on its own. At times it might be the two together, providing a really comprehensive framework, but that also recognizing there may be some experiences that aren't being captured well by the law. And then thinking together what that means, and what that means both on the ground, but also what that means in legal discourse, which is, you know, like our colleague Sam writing an article on
I think particularly the point on the legal documentation is so important in so many conflict areas. Like we're doing some research work now with Save the Children for Yemen. And it's the number one point because then it's the gateway to everything else. Like if you don't have the documentation, you don't have access to the education, you don't have access to healthcare. So that's really like, as you say, in the midst of the conflict, people still think that is a key need because that gives them other things, and particularly for children, right? So,
and it feeds into your comments actually about you maybe you want to pick it up.
Christina.
Like with the child registrations, there was a huge problem when during the 2014-2022, when children like Ukrainians living in the all areas under the Russian control, it was the de facto authorities like the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. They were given the registration, which was not recognized by any state. And there was a very complex process then to travel to Ukraine, then to go to the court to dispute that act and to get a birth certificate which will recognize you as a person and give you a right to go to school. Now everything which is under Russian occupation gives you the Russian child certificate and you give the nationality of Russia. Which is like depends. Like I agree that like there will be some part of people who potentially might agree with this, but for the majority, the nationality by identity will be very different. And I guess when we talk about compliance, and Ioana also talked about the colonial approach, I guess, and also Rahma told about root causes, I guess it will very different. It will different in every context. what was the root cause. And if this is the identity cause, then the conflict will be till the very, very end. Because you are fighting for, like, each side is fighting for something, for what they believe is right. And many respondents in our case study actually describe the conflict, like the international armed conflict of Russia and Ukraine, as the colonial war, as something that is not being seen widely in West, because we get used to that it's only West who used to be a colonial power, but it's not only. So that approach is also starting, like the narrative about this is getting more and more actual in Ukraine.
We're going to open up for questions, but first I would like to give Rama the opportunity to respond or react to anything that has been said here. Rama? Can you hear me?
Yes, Anki, sorry, and I've been trying to type because I can barely hear you. It's just my internet is very poor. So I'm sorry. Is there any specific question that I can respond to now?
No, I said we're going to open up to questions because I'm sure there are many questions. So I don't want to monopolize the panel. There's just if you had any direct inputs or responses to what was mentioned now in the panel.
Yeah, sorry again. I can hear you now, but for a while I was completely lost. So really sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. We're going to open up to questions and we get back to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Start in the room. Okay, we can start with 1, 2, 3. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Definitely. Thank you. My name is Anhal. I'm from Lebanon. I come from a country that's always torn between different communities. We have lots of non-state armed groups, be it Palestinians, Syrians, or Hezbollah, or even different factions that belong to political parties that are not within the Lebanese armed forces. My question is, how can we apply DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and to reintegrate these non-state armed groups into the society, taking into account that there are lots of civilians that support these armed groups, and they believe that these armed groups are protecting them in certain cases or in certain areas because of the lack of, or because of how weak the government is and how effective the government is. So we'd be being torn between these communities always supporting these armed groups and the legality of these armed groups. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take, we have 2 more questions here. Yes.
Okay.
Whoever is first, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is John. I'm from Colombia. So apologize in advance for my English. So yes, something I would like to say thank you for everything that you are doing in our countries in conflict. So I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, our countries, I'm talking about Colombia, so we lack out the trust in the international organizations, to be honest. So we lost the hope that we can find peace in our territories, even so we have more than 50 years in conflict, you know. And yeah, my organization that I am part here is we are working in try to fix or to repair the internal damage in the people, especially emotional, mental, but also spiritual as well. You know, not only physical and material. So in territories that we are, maybe the word I can think is poor countries. You know, the physical, material things doesn't matter a lot, especially the internal or integral things for the people. And in this we call has a holistic approach. You know, this is the organization we try to work a lot in different times that we arrive to Colombia and Haiti. So my question specific is so we try to do this kind of experience about reconciliation with ex-guerrilla fighters. They arrive to the communities and say sorry or ask for forgiveness to the people. It's really powerful. because bring peace and bring reconciliation and restoration, not only for the people, but also for the community. And it's really, really powerful. So my question for you is, in a country as Colombia, for example, when the religion is really important, you know, Catholic or Christian worldview, from your experience or your knowledge, how can the religion or the spirituality influence in the armed conflicts to repair the integral needs in the people, especially in long-term conflicts, as a Colombian, for example? So, thank you so much.
One more, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for all the information you guys shared. I especially appreciate having the perspective of not only the physical needs, but also the psychological needs as well. I'm a youth representative with the Center for International Justice and Reconciliation, and my question is more general and a bit more just practical of what we can be doing now with the research that you shared with us. So I wanted to just, now that we have this perspective of the approach of harm plus need, and knowing that you guys have this heart for conflict and for addressing these scenarios, I wanted to just pose the question to you guys of what is your call to action for us as an audience and as individual people now with what you've shared with us?
Okay. Thank you. I think we will start with those questions. I think maybe obviously, Joanna, the one on maybe religious leaders and spiritual healing. I think it's for you, so let's start with that one.
Thank you very much. I would really love to actually hear the view of Rama and Constantina on this as well. So I wonder if
Yeah, maybe if Rama can start.
Rama and Constantina first, and then.
Yeah.
Perfect. Do you want to start?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. I may not be hearing properly, so sorry if I'm jumping line. Sorry. So there were two views in especially the effect of Islam on the conflict. So the majority in the urban settings, in where the government controlled areas, even most part of the insurgent control areas, they feel Islam is protecting them, but it's people who are misinterpreting and using it wrongly. So yes, so that's the mainstream view of Islam has guidelines on the instructions on how conflict is supposed to be resolved. The rules are clear. It's just the people who decided to follow a wrong version of the views of this Islam. And one of the key harm that the conflict has created, that the community shared, is distortion of social and religious understanding of the Somalis, the way they used to be, and a new understanding, a corrupt form, and a very harmful form is being pushed into the young people, the ideologies that are being pushed into these young people who are becoming violent, who are becoming corrupt. So that is the mainstream view. But there are few younger people who actually believe this is what Islam is. Islam is supposed to, I mean, these people who have been changed, the younger people, some of them I talked to in reintegration facility, and they clearly think that yes, we are changing, this was wrong, but sometimes you would think it's they still feel like they are right, that they are on a right course. They are the ones defending the right religion, and these other people are the ones who are corrupting the religion. So there are two views. But then if you think, if I will put a number on this, probably 99% of the community I talked to and the community that we assessed, they believe that Islam is, religion is protecting them.
Thank you very much.
I will be short on the spiritual harm. I normally don't like to comment on other contexts because I think like if you don't live that life, you cannot grasp the context very well. And I honestly also expected that, for instance, in the case of Ukraine, there will be some correlation with religion and compliance. So in our interview, I forgot to say that in my panel, we found no correlation at all. People didn't say that religion played a role in compliance or restraint from violations. So Ukraine is Ukraine is a Christian country, so that's the majority of the religion, but there is a minority of Muslim and also Jewish people. But still, the majority is Christians. So. We didn't found that correlation in our case study, which doesn't mean that there is no correlation. I know that for Colombia, there is also, and in Ukraine, such concept as spiritual harm was never mentioned. But I know that in Colombia, there was also a special tribunal, and land was even identified as a subject and not an object, as something who also suffered and witnessed the war, which
As
is
a victim.
Yes, a victim. Yes, and that is something where, which is very different from the culture I'm from. So I honestly don't think that I can give you a correct response. But that would honestly admire me, because I learned that when I was studying in the US at the university about that approach, which makes a total sense, that we oversee many aspects of what is important for several peoples. And I know that forgiveness sometimes might work better compared to prosecution and compared to criminal prosecution and putting those people committing alleged crimes to prison. Like for majority of Christian people, it might be more useful to get a recognition that they suffered. That's what they need, and not to be put. There is also a lot of cases, for instance, in Rwanda after the genocide in Rwanda, when those who were convicted for the genocide denied that they committed genocide. So for me, prosecution and criminal liability doesn't mean that there will be reconciliation. And in this case, religion and forgiveness might play a much better role compared to a typical legal way to address this issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. I'm going to try to address the questions you asked together, and thank you for my colleagues for their interventions. One of the projects that I was involved in the past was the Generating Respect project, which looked at, examined the role of religious leaders in influencing parties to the armed conflict towards compliance or non-compliance with humanitarian norms, that is IHL plus IHRL. And what we found, again, it was a socio-legal project. It relied on empirical research in six case study countries done with Geneva Co, in partnership with Geneva Co. And what we found is the role of religious leaders can play a really important, the religious leader can play an important role in armed conflict, but need not to. It's not necessarily a given. Just because a population is religious, profoundly religious, it's not necessarily the case that religion plays a role or that these leaders have an influence. And that's because what we found is that it's very much about the special legitimacy that religious leaders enjoy or do not enjoy among their communities and among the armed actors. And whether they enjoy this legitimacy very much depends on how they're perceived and their behavior in armed conflict. And also in the post-conflict or post-authoritarian period, their role in reconciliation, for example, or truth initiatives and so on, very much depends on whether they're seen as complicit in the violence or in the abuse that had been perpetrated in the period beforehand. If they're seen as complicit, if they're seen as perpetrators themselves, which they are, because religious leaders can really occupy various positions. They can be leaders of armed groups, for example, we have this example, then they won't be perceived as having the legitimacy to lead this kind of processes. I think one of the most interesting areas really comes from Colombia, and Anki would know so much more about that because it's one of her research areas, and my colleague Pier Giuseppe Parisi and our Colombian colleagues work very much with, so we work as part of the Beyond Compliance Consortium with an indigenous group. That's our local partner. They do research on protection, spiritual protection mechanisms, and you know, it goes way beyond the IHL framework, but it's what makes sense there. It's something that again inspires us and inform also perhaps thinking in other contexts. So what I'm basically saying is that you probably have much more interesting things to tell me than I can tell you on this topic. But if anyone is interested in the Generating Respect project and the outcome, we do have a document that is called Consideration and Guidance for the Humanitarian Engagement with Religious Leaders. It's mainly addressed to humanitarian organizations and asks them and provides them guidance what questions they should ask themselves before they engage with religious leaders, how they should do it, and so on.
I don't know, Catherine, if you wanted to address maybe the Lebanon question on the it's a difficult one.
So it's not one of our case studies, and so, like Christina, I'm reluctant to pretend I have expertise on an issue that
It's similar to the Syria case.
But what I think I sort of slightly wish that some of our political science team were here, in particular Anastasia Shirastarina, because her research is really essential to our project in bringing the perspective, and also actually some of the work, for example, Florian Weigand has done on the relationship between civilian communities and armed groups. And I think that the kind of nuance that this political science research is bringing into the legal space of always looking at the armed groups' relationship with the civilian communities and doing it both issue by issue and group by group, so never presuming a particular relationship. Your question made me remember a podcast episode that we have in the last series of the podcast, which was actually on ETA and the disarmament of ETA and the decision-making that went on when they decided to lay down their arms, and the role of the civilian communities in doing that. And there was if you look on our website, you'll see that the speakers include a number of reports which they were involved in the writing of, which tried to identify particular indicators out of that situation which might be transferable to a different situation in terms of lessons learned for success. So yeah, I would encourage you to look at that. Actually, it made me also think that we have an episode, a very nice episode, with an interview with Pierre Parisi and Mahmoud Darwish on the importance of land in both Palestine and Colombia, and the relationship, the sketching out of harm done by disappropriation of land, and how the harm is very much informed by the relationship that a civilian community might have with the land, which of course is going to be different per context. And there too, both interviewees were sharing their research on the role of civilian communities in then protecting their lands against different armed actors. So maybe take a listen of that.
So we're running short of time. I don't know, do we have one question from online that we can take? And then we do a last round, 1 minute each, answering also to the call to action question.
Oh yeah, we could end with that.
Yeah, there are a few questions.
Just one key question, and then everyone gets 1 minute.
Just a very practical one that can be answered quickly, and then another one. Like there's so what fantastic presentation. Is there a white paper or document that we can download from this presentation, or like how people can follow like the result of the research? And then so this is very easy. And then the second question is about MHPSS. And somebody, Emmanuel, is asking about, have you explored why psychosocial interventions or MHPSS are so often excluded from recovery, protection, or post-conflict responses, whether in emergency or development aid.
Okay, so let's do a final round, and please also address the call to action question. I think that's very important. Rama, let's start with you. Could you hear the questions? On why mental health and psychological support is excluded often in the responses, and then also there was a question of what should we do, a call to action to people who are motivated to contribute.
Yeah. So I probably got this from the analysis rather than the discussion we had on the ground. So one of the reasons why psychosocial issues are most likely left out is because of maybe reliance on the official narrative that just was focusing on the bare minimum for harm, like the actual killing and maybe destruction of resources, rather than the deeper meaning of harm and how the community understands. And I think that will be one. But maybe another thing that comes up is kind of resources. What is an emergency? Like food, people are dying because of food, and then would you rather talk of a psychosocial? I think the limitation in terms of resources will be another key issue. Thank you.
Anything, Rama, on the call to action, what people can do to help implement harm plus need approach from the outside also?
Yeah, I think just clarifying first, focusing on the need of the real need of the community for Somalia, because it's a protracted system. It's a conflict that has been ongoing for so long. So the people, the communities themselves are not just asking for their immediate needs. They are asking for justice. Everything comes after we find justice. The conflict will resolve once we have a just system. Just deal with it. So I think that's kind of what to focus on. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Christina?
Call for action. I would say not copy-pasting harm and need approach from one country to another. For instance, in Ukraine, which is a developed context, several interventions which arrived in 2022 was not adapted to the context. The other one about the mental health, I don't know why, because I never lived in the context which was in a stage of protracted or recovery, so I didn't experience that. But I honestly think that maybe because first of all, there are other priorities to focus, but at the same time, also like all of the humanitarian organization work in a log frame of indicators, and it's really hard to show the impact of mental health support. And I would say that just like a last word, that for us as Civic, we always say, also like when we talk to military, that protection of civilians is a military strategic advantage, because for a long-term game, it gives you much more strategic advantage than you will violate IHL. So from any perspective, whether you are in military or you are a local actor, protection of civilians should be in your core of your activity. Thank you.
Yeah, on the question of the call to action, I think it's a brilliant question. I would address it to various stakeholders. So for me, as the principal investigator of this project, I think what I'm trying to do is to listen. Other researchers in my position, I'm an Eastern European woman educated in the West. I'm trying to be aware of my privileges, and I'm trying to be reflexive about them. I'm trying to listen. And I'm trying to translate that also in the methodology. So we're a group of people that really come together. I don't think I've ever worked with such a kind group of people that are self-reflexive. And I think that's what we're all trying to do, being aware of that. When it comes to humanitarian actors, I would say be humble. And again, listen to what people on the ground tell you that is needed, and listen to what they identify as the harm. And be more courageous, actually, in listening. When it comes to donors and when it comes to really the common individual, what you can do in relation to donors, I'd say be more political. I think we should rediscover politics and the importance of politics and of strategies beyond the law. Yeah, that's basically my call to action.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot that needs doing. Yeah, so I've sat in meetings recently in the Netherlands about civilian harm and civilian protection, when really what was being discussed were airstrikes, and that was really the only thing that was being discussed. So it was kind of discussions about the principle of distinction, the principle of proportionality, redress, and I think it's important to push back against this very narrow definition of civilian harm, because what people in the room were discussing was really civilian casualties and injuries to civilians and loss to damage to civilian objects. And yet nobody was noticing quite the extent to which this jargon had been taken on. So these two words, civilian harm and civilian protection, were being bounced around the room in a way that I felt was leaving out so much experience. Now, I think everyone in the room knew that, of course. I mean, they knew that. But the point was that these words had become kind of jargonized such that there wasn't really another word to use to describe what these words should have really been referring to. So I think it's sort of important to push back on that narrowing. What else? I mean, there's of course an awful lot of work that needs to be done on the IHL framework right now, and forgetting a lot of what we've been discussing about going beyond the law. I'm now talking about the law, and here we can think about double standards. We can think about very permissive interpretations of the IHL, which are kind of eroding the protection out of it. We can think of kind of security sinkholes where the word security is just kind of sucking out the humanitarian core of the norm. There's of course it's urgent. What else? Yeah, I would say also not perhaps falling into the tendency to, in a time of funding cuts, to kind of double down on minimum standards that may be pre-packaged, like you said, without taking due account of the needs on the ground, which should be context-driven. So whilst the harm and need approach we're suggesting may be criticised for seeming very broad, I actually think if applied correctly, and I think this comes back to something you were going to say right at the beginning, if applied correctly, could end up offering a narrower package of assistance than a kind of pre-packaged package might offer. So I think it would be a mistake to think this contextual approach is utopian in our current world of funding cuts. I actually think if applied well, it could be appropriate to the current climate.
I think it's really like a question of prioritization, and the prioritization coming from the right place.
Exactly.
Right. And we know there are funding cuts, but people are prioritizing protection, legal documentation, etc. So that's what we need to listen to, I think. And also, like in the consortium, we are 6 operational organizations, let's say. So like there is the academic core, but there are also organizations who are operating in conflict. And of course, we are working with other organizations. So really, this is also kind of getting out there. Maybe just the final point on that. So there was a question on the publication. So as Joanna said, the paper is coming out 8th of December. There are physical publications here on the page of the Beyond Compliance Consortium. You can also access all the documents. So with that, thank you so much, and for your patience. We have 5 minutes. Anna?
colleague in
I know. I already recognize that.
Yeah, the mix-up.
Yeah, I mean.